We are back with another of what I like to call Star Wars Mandalorian rectangular table discussion. If you've ever been to my apartment, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, and you'll get that reference. We just watched what I think was probably the best episode of Mandalorian out of any of the episodes, any of the seasons. I'm almost wondering if this was the jump the shark moment for the show. What did you think of it?
A lot of the episodes, it feels like you're just kind of going through a generic MMO of the Star Wars universe. This actually felt like you're watching Star Wars. It's been like the opening band's playing, and like now it's like the band you came to see. It's like the headliner.
Ever since watching the episode, I've been reading online, a lot of people were saying that episode felt like watching a Star Wars movie.
Exactly.
For whatever reason, even just like the graphics and just like everything in the background, it just looks so much more crisp. Even though they were in like a foresty kind of like foggy setting, it just felt like really like crystal clear. Everything just aesthetically looked really good. There was a good amount of Ahsoka, and unfortunately I don't think we're going to get any more Ahsoka after that.
Probably at least not this season.
Partially why I say that is because I was looking on IMDb, which I don't know if they just update that as soon as there are...
I think they have been updating that episode by episode so they're not like spoiling things.
I was wondering if that was any kind of spoiler at all, because Rosario Dawson has one credit, and it's Mandalorian Season 2, 2020. The coolest bounty hunter to me is Cad Bane, because he purposely had these implants in his neck, which didn't really make it easier or whatever to breathe. It was to try to combat being force choked. If his actual like neck got choked by the Force, he could still get air and he could counteract the Force. He strategically gadgetized himself to try to combat a lot of the stuff that Jedi could use, because he knew as a bounty hunter he may end up having to go against Force wielders and Jedi. That was the biggest threat in his mind, and he put those things and some other stuff like jet rocket boots to try to combat the agility and jumping ability of Jedi. He was smart like that.
And you've said how you think he might still be alive.
I don't know if Cad Bane's death has been canonically confirmed or not. I've been trying to look around online or read around and see if there's anything. I think it's mostly just theorized what happened to him. I believe there were supposed to be Clone Wars episodes where there was some sort of Boba Fett versus Cad Bane conflict, but I believe they were never finished because I think the show was canceled. I think there was a cancellation of the Clone Wars after Season 5, and then it was picked up by Disney, and they came out with the 13-episode Season 6, which was like the lost episodes or whatever, or the lost missions, I should say. And then obviously that was like 2014 or whatever. They just finished Season 7 like 5 years after that. I like the lost missions and I like Season 7, but you could tell the show kind of was at its major peak between Seasons like 2 and 4.
So if Cad Bane is still alive, we may get that showdown. It may not be with the same Boba Fett that is in the Clone Wars.
I think fans want to see that. I don't know if enough Star Wars fans care about the bounty hunters, or maybe they care more about the bounty hunters. Cad Bane is one of my favorite characters. I think him and Maul are probably my two favorite characters in the whole Clone Wars show. I was also a big fan of Ventress, but I think Ventress's death is canonically confirmed. So I don't think we would get Ventress unless they just retcon that. It's really just hard to tell what Disney recognizes from the EU and what they don't recognize. They've kind of started factoring in some EU stuff into the canon timeline, but there's so much stuff that they just basically ignored and act like it never happened. So steering gears back towards this most recent episode that we watched, we got a lot of Easter eggs, and we got a lot of stuff where predictions and some of the wild theories we seem to come up with on this show can really get out of hand. Do you think we will get Grand Admiral Thrawn in Season 2?
No.
I am wondering if the next two episodes are going to be like very Moff Gideon oriented. And then if we get teased Grand Admiral Thrawn in Episode 8, like maybe at the very end
like
or something.
His voice off screen.
Maybe he comes up and finds Moff Gideon dead or something, and then it's like he's got some snarky comment.
Moff Gideon works for him and goes to him and failed, and yeah. you see him actually kill him.
Are we thinking that they are on the same team, or are they separate entities and Thrawn is actually just like a lot more cunning and intelligent so he could easily overtake? Or do you think at this point in time, do you think Thrawn is back at his fullest influence as far as the Empire is concerned, and you think Moff Gideon is just another like subsidiary of the Empire and Thrawn is really the ultimate who's running the show?
I think Moff Gideon is subordinate to Thrawn.
What's confusing to me is even Star Wars Theory was talking about this in his breakdown of the episode. He wasn't sure when exactly we are in the timeline because the epilogue of Rebels, I believe, is supposed to be like 6 years after Endor. And this show picked up 5 years after Endor. And where we are in Season 2, it could be about a year or so after Season 1 started. I'm wondering if when Ahsoka left the child with Din at the end of Episode 5, canonically speaking, is that when she goes off and meets up with Sabine, and this is where they start their journey to try to find Ezra. And Ahsoka is looking for Thrawn because she wasn't with them on Lothal when those whales went to wherever they went. We don't know yet. I don't know if Ahsoka knew about any of that, and so maybe she is about to track down Sabine, and now we're picking up like where that epilogue left off. If you had to say one way or the other, do you think that Thrawn has been back this whole time, or do you think she genuinely just doesn't know that any of that happened with Ezra, and now she's going to go track down Sabine, and then like off-screen stuff is happening with Sabine, and then that can be its own show, and then this current show in the same timeline, Din and the child are doing whatever shenanigans that they're going to do. Do you have any theories as to which Jedi might end up being the one that reaches out to Grogu, assuming they make it to Tython?
You pointed out that cat, which is a strong indicator that it would be Ezra.
That is possibly just, oh hey, look at this Loth cat, but it could also be an Easter egg foreshadow of Ezra Bridger.
They do try to casually name drop a lot of Star Wars-y names of things, I feel like, in the show. So it might just be a, hey, look, we know stuff about Star Wars.
The other thing that I want to know is how does Ahsoka know so much about Grogu? Because she said that Grogu was trained at the Jedi Temple or whatever before the Clone Wars. Based on something I watched, also Star Wars Theory, he was saying that Anakin would have been like 9 or 10 around the time when Grogu was starting his training or was in the process of his training. Ahsoka wouldn't have even been alive yet. I'm wondering if somehow Ahsoka got all this information that she seems to have secondhand, or if she just somehow basically read Grogu's mind with the Force. I don't know how she seems to know so much.
That's kind of what I assumed, is that she did her little mind meld thing with it and like saw the images of what it saw and recognized them. Like, oh, I know that that's the Jedi Temple.
This whole time I've been convinced that Grogu, I assume that it was a clone, but now I'm really starting to think it's not. But at the same time, I guess it could be still possible that it was a clone and then it was just immediately placed in the Jedi Temple.
Do you think that it's they were trying to clone Force using things before they just like did regular foot soldiers, and they tried it once and it didn't really work, so they were trying to they're hiding it in the temple to cover their mistake?
I think I see where you're going with this, and maybe that's why they were so opposed to Sifo Dyas creating a clone army. Maybe they tried it before Sifo Dyas had his Force vision of conflict that involved the Jedi needing an army. Maybe that's why they were adamantly against it, because they had tried cloning, and maybe that's why they told him not to, and then obviously Sifo Dyas ended up going behind their back and basically signing off on the creation of a clone army. But at the same time, I don't know if he ever proposed creating one with other Force users. I don't know if that's something that the hero team, so to speak, would try. That really seems more like a dark side Force user tactic. But at the same time, I mean, the Jedi have done stuff that they weren't proud of doing and then tried to cover their ass.
As the mythos has gone on, they get a little murkier of, like, yeah, they're called the light side and the dark side, but they're not, like, always the good guy. Like, they might have good intentions that don't pan out. The ends justify the means for them sometimes, and they are sometimes hypocritical.
That's why I like Qui-Gon and Ahsoka, because they make no bones about it. They're like, yeah, I use the code as more of a guideline, but I have my own interpretation. If the ends justify the means for what I interpret as overall the better of two evils, that's the decision I'm going to make. I almost think that Maul adopted that kind of mindset as well. People consider Maul like an obvious villain or whatever. I don't really consider Maul a villain, especially after he was rescued from the garbage planet and revived by Mother Talzin. I think he still had a vendetta against Obi-Wan, which isn't, I guess, a heroic thing to have, but at the same time, his goal was to eliminate the Sith just as much as the Jedi. He's really more of a neutral, if anything. He offered to try to team up with Ahsoka. It's like, as long as you're not directly against his objective, then you're not really an enemy.
He's like Lobo.
Well, he doesn't really care if you identify as Jedi, if you identify as hero, villain. He's got
chaotic neutral.
He's got no gripe with you if you're not directly opposing his own narrative and agenda. And I think that's kind of like what Vader really was for the Empire for a lot of ways. He had his own ideas, and he kind of went off on his own a lot to try to find his own answers. He was inhibited by his suit so that he could never overthrow the Empire, or the Emperor, I should say. And that's why he did a lot of subjectively evil things in favor of the Emperor, because the Emperor had that control over him. And so it's like, well, okay, I guess I'll do this. But at the same time, he was off doing his own thing. I think he had his own goals, and I think he was trying to figure out how to somehow overthrow the Emperor.
Most of his comic arcs are like, well, he's on the outs with the Empire, and yes, he is trying to have his own contingency plans.
Star Wars Theory on YouTube said that in the Dr. Aphra comics that she takes Vader to Tython, whatever this planet is that...
They help each other and are always, like, double-crossing each other.
Well, the point was, though, is, like, he specifically said that this planet that Ahsoka told Din to take Grogu, it's been canonically used where Aphra was showing Vader something. I don't know all the specifics.
Yeah, I don't remember all the details, but Dr. Aphra is a good comic. Mostly because she's got an evil C-3PO.
What I really like about Episode 5, other than the fact that Ahsoka stole the show, as she tends to do, it was just a very well-balanced 40-minute mini Star Wars movie. It almost really works as its own standalone episode, just like Season 1 had the rescue or whatever, which was kind of its own standalone episode. I liked this episode because it really left it open-ended. It's not necessarily easy to predict what's going to happen with this specific show. It could really go a lot of different ways. Knowing what we know now, and I guess knowing what we're assuming, what are your predictions for Chapter 14 and moving forward?
I think the next episode is going to be like the focusing on Moff Gideon's backstory and like his motivations and where he's coming from. They're going to have another confrontation with him, and then he's going to, now that we know that Thrawn is a factor in the series, I think that at the very end of the season, Moff Gideon's going to like run away, and you're going to hear Thrawn be like, oh, you failed. He's going to still have the Darksaber, and he, like, there'll be a big thing with that. It's like, oh, you've acquired a toy that you don't fully deserve, and he's gonna behead him with the Darksaber.
I wasn't expecting that. I like the way you think. That'd be sweet. We know that Moff Gideon indirectly installed some sort of tracker on the Razor Crest, which didn't really play a factor at all in this episode, which I was expecting it to.
Yeah. It's almost as if they wanted you to forget that happened.
I'm wondering why it didn't, but maybe wherever the Moff Gideon base is, where he's got those Dark Troopers / possibly Darth Vader clones. Maybe it's just too far away from Corvus to beat him there, or maybe he just wasn't on Corvus long enough. I mean, it seems like he was there for 2 days, though, or 2 rotations, as they say in Star Wars. That did feel very plot armor-ish. I was really wondering, like, okay, why not? But at the same time,
there is a lot packed into this episode. That probably is going to come up again next episode. Like, oh yeah, remember how they put that on there?
I'm not an expert on Star Wars navigation or, like, geography, so I don't know how close proximity Navarro 7 is to Corvus. It could be the kind of thing where he just got there really quickly, and maybe Moff Gideon's on the other side of the galaxy, and like they could really very well be tracking him, and they didn't get there in time. He just wasn't on Corvus long enough.
Or remember how the First Order had a whole map of all of the surrounding areas around Luke Skywalker's island and still couldn't find the island?
And the First Order could track people through light speed, though. So they could just instantly port to wherever.
Yeah, they could blow up 5 different planets at once just to power up their Death Star, and they still can't find a thing that they have all the other pieces of a map. It's whatever serves the story, the plot at that second.
We talked about this either 2 episodes ago or last episode at the possibility of Grogu being not necessarily a Sith, but being like an evil character or being a dark side force wielder.
Neutral, or just a baby that has no, like Majin Buu from Dragon Ball Z, like it's destructive but doesn't know any better.
The impression that I got from Ahsoka was that he does know better, though, because Din kept saying like he doesn't understand or he's stubborn, and Ahsoka's like, yeah, he does. He understands perfectly. He's been masking his abilities this whole time. I hope that they kind of do go their separate ways. I wonder if it's going to almost be just like how Obi-Wan trained Anakin and then all of a sudden they were fighting each other. I wonder if it's going to start another Mandalorian versus Jedi, I guess not civil war, but like, I guess war. Grogu's got his team of Jedi and Din's got his team of Mandalorians. Maybe it's going to be like Secret Wars, where it's like Mandalorians versus Jedi. Do you think that has any possibility of happening?
They'd have to build that for a season or so.
Do you think there's any possibility of Grogu and Din going their separate ways? Or do you think that's just going to be like Cloak and Dagger, like they're always together?
Well, what if they do like you're already hooked on the show, we don't need a cute little doll anymore. And it just goes away and they never explain it.
If Grogu gets written out of the show, I don't think people will watch. I think more so people have been hanging on to the hope that Ahsoka and some of the characters that we actually do like are going to show up at some point.
And now they have, so we don't need a cute little baby.
I'd almost rather they write out the main title character and see what the show would be like without him, because I generally like the side characters better so far. But at the same time, it could be the kind of thing where the side characters, if they get their own chance to shine on their own, maybe they're only so good as the star supporting cast. Kind of like how in the Avengers or like in the MCU, the Hulk is really good as like a comedic relief or just like a side character.
I think that's because they don't have the distribution rights to the character, so they've adapted by doing that.
And ironically, the title character, or like the Bruce Banner, was canceled out of that show, or that movie, I should say. That might be also why Hulk didn't get more standalone movies, because Edward Norton wasn't going to be the Bruce Banner. I just also found those movies to be boring. Hulk doesn't really work as the main protagonist. He's really better as like a sideshow, and they ultimately turn him into a comedic relief. Some of these other characters that are supposed to be second fiddle to Din, do you think they would work as their own show?
In the classic Star Wars, Luke is seen as the main character, but no one really likes Luke. Everybody likes Han and Chewie and all the other side characters. All the other side characters become more interesting. There's a whole cracked video about how the main character of a series or a franchise is deliberately boring and neutral so that you can be that character, and it's like you're the one interacting with all the characters you actually like. Harry Potter is the same way. Like, Hermione's the cool one, and Ron's the comic relief. Harry's just the boring one that the book happens to be named after. And they also say that's why, like, Keanu Reeves is such a good protagonist, and why the John Wick series is so successful, because he's like this everyman that you can project yourself onto, and you're doing all the, like, cool action killing.
Star Wars Theory was saying that he thinks that the Jedi that Grogu reaches out to is ultimately going to be Luke Skywalker, and that they might do a CGI aged-down version of Luke Skywalker.
Or like a Tupac hologram of Luke Skywalker?
If you had to guess right now, who do you think that the Jedi that ultimately reaches out to Grogu is going to be? Or do you think there will be? There could be the kind of thing where maybe they
Or a Sith Lord could be listening in and reaching out to Grogu.
Yeah, if they were going to bring Maul back from the dead for a second time, this would be a good time to do it. Because Maul is a strong enough connection to the Force where he could sense something like that, and he could show up.
Or we find out that Moff Gideon is a Force user.
We think that he's not, because, or at least I do, and a couple, I guess, of the Star Wars YouTube channels say that he's not. Because if he was, he would just be using his own blood to experiment.
Oh, I guess so.
We don't know who this volunteer is, per se, that's been donating high midichlorian count blood. So that still is a mystery in and out of itself. I'm also wondering if possibly Ezra was captured, and maybe that's how they're getting the blood. That would have to lend credence to the fact that this is taking place after they already somehow found him, or somehow Thrawn captured Ezra, and somehow he's their prisoner. Maybe Grogu gets to Tython, he reaches out through the Force, and Ezra senses it, and they find out that Ezra needs help, and maybe that's
how they started on their journey to go find him?
Well, no, I'm guessing that that's how they figure out that Ezra's in trouble, is that if Grogu reaches out through the Force, and Ezra, I guess, answers, maybe Ezra is, like, within an inch of his life, because they've been taking so much blood from him to experiment on some other volunteer that we don't know. Maybe the volunteer is Thrawn. Maybe Thrawn is trying to become Force sensitive. That would be interesting, but that would also make sense, because in order for Thrawn to feasibly rule the galaxy as, like, the new emperor, so to speak, he would probably need
the
Force abilities. Palpatine was only able to do it because he was probably the most powerful Force wielder in the galaxy, and then he had the second most powerful...
Like how Lex Luthor is always trying to create serums that give, like, Kryptonian power.
Maybe Dr. Pershing is the volunteer. Maybe he's trying to, like, double-cross them. Maybe he's trying to get Force sensitivity and, I guess, use the Empire to give him an ability to defeat them. Maybe Dr. Pershing is, like, a prisoner, and he's kind of slow-playing him until he can figure out a way to enhance himself.
I think there are a lot of factions of the Empire that are competing for some type of edge to become the dominant wing.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. Is, like, I almost wonder if it's going to get to the point where Moff Gideon teams up with Din and Grogu and Ahsoka, because maybe Thrawn is his own entity, and he's obviously probably a lot more cunning and strategically sound. Maybe Moff Gideon will have to team up with them to overthrow Thrawn, or maybe Thrawn will be powerful enough to the point where the quote-unquote good guys are resorting to teaming up with subsidiaries of the Empire, such as Moff Gideon, who are powerful enough, but he can't quite overtake everything, and the heroes need all the help they can get to overtake whatever ultimate conflict arises from Thrawn that I think is on the horizon. I guess it's kind of similar in a parallel to in Secret Wars when Magneto was put on the hero side. From a certain point of view, he's evil because he's trying to kill off the humans, but his ultimate idealism is innately good, where he cares so much for mutant kind that he's willing to kill a whole other race, but that inherently outweighs killing humans because it's for such a love of mutant kind. Therefore, he's actually heroic and his intentions are noble. I don't know if we get any kind of vibe like that from Gideon, but just trying to think of ideas where maybe Moff Gideon actually ends up teaming up with Din, and that would be a very good plot twist.
Empires have to make you think they're doing something good for people and, like, sell people on it. Like, they don't get that many people working for them without, like, thinking they're doing something somewhat right.
Well, I think they're incentivizing people by saying you can be a part of the Empire and be a part of the one that's enslaving all these other people, or you can be the one that you could be the one that's either dead or be the one that's being enslaved. In Lothal, when Rebels is going on, they go back to Lothal quite a bit. It's clear that it's basically like an internment camp, but they don't really have any other choice. And so they kind of just begrudgingly go along with it because they're not being necessarily cruel and unusually enslaved. We're giving you this dome and we're giving you rationed out supplies and stuff, and we're not going to actively kill you. We're doing just enough so that you can't uprise against us, but we're also like the ones keeping you alive, so you don't have any other choice kind of thing. It's not necessarily slavery, but it's also like not the most ideal way to live.
Not slavery.
Do you think we'll get Sabine in this show?
Eventually. Like, maybe like the Ezra crying out for help thing is what spawns Ahsoka to go recruit her, I think is what you were getting at before, right?
There's an epilogue that's like roughly 5 to 6 years after Endor. And at the very end, we see Ahsoka in a cloak and Sabine, and she's talking about how she finally understood what Ezra meant when he said, "I'm counting on you." It's unclear where we are in Mandalorian in relation to that epilogue. I'm tending to support what Theory was saying to an extent. It makes a lot of sense just based on Jason Syndulla's age. That was his rationalization, was that Jason Syndulla was canonically considered 6 years old. That epilogue taking place like 6 years after Endor would make sense. It's just unclear if we're at that point or how close to that point, because like we know that this show was supposed to take place 5 years after Endor, but at the same time, in that 5 to 6 years, a lot could have happened with Ezra and Thrawn. We don't know if they're still wherever. We don't know if they've been in a massive conflict this whole time. There's a whole lot of unknown, which kind of makes the timeline...
some wormhole where like minutes pass like days.
It could be its own convoluted timeline. So I'm really interested, and this goes back to how I like how it's very open-ended, because it's not exactly easy to predict. It can go whichever direction that it goes, and it'll probably genuinely be a surprise, whatever ends up happening. We've rambled on long enough. Thank you all for tuning in and listening to another episode of the Salzy Squad. As always, you can interact with the podcast on Twitter at NES9. You can interact with the podcast on Facebook. Just look up the Nathan Says Podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe on Spotify as well as Apple Podcasts. Catch you in the next one.